How's it going, guys? This is just a real quick little video on how to disassemble the bolt for a Browning T-bolt. I couldn't really find any reliable sources online or any YouTube videos, so I thought I would be that guy that made the video so that someone else doesn't make the same mistakes I did, because in trying to pull this bolt apart I managed to damage my mainspring the first time around. I put a bit of force into it, and I've since discovered that no force is sort of required to pull it apart. It fits together very nicely. Alright, first things first, we just make sure the rifle is unloaded. So we just take the magazine out and check the chamber so we can see that that's clear. So the way that you pull the bolt out in a Browning T-bolt, by the way, is it requires the safety to be engaged. So red is fire safe, and when it's in the safe position, there's a rocker on the inside which is connected to the trigger. It just tilts the rocker up and allows it to be removed. Here's this little piece of silver metal just here underneath the bolt. That is the sort of the top portion of that rocker. So if you just push that down at this point, the bolt should slide cleanly out. And you can see the sort of the leading edge of that rocker in there. And maybe in another video I'll disassemble the trigger assembly and show how that works. So here is our Browning T-bolt bolt in the cocked or open position. And basically the way that it works is when you have the bolt pushed in and locked, this toggle slides through, and the round surfaces on each side, these buttons on the edge of the toggle, is what locks into the receiver. It's got matching cutouts here in the receiver, so that locks the action closed. It's quite strong enough for a 22. And then you fire. Here's your firing pin running down the middle here, protruding here, rim fire. So you fire the rifle, and then when you go to recock the rifle, you pull the bolt straight back, it's a straight pull, and you watch, when you cam it back there, it actually compresses the mainspring somewhat. So you can sort of see here, this stud just here is the rear end of the firing pin, and when you open the action, it actually rides up a cam. You see that? So this firing pin rides up a cam on this lug here, and it basically pre-charges the spring so that when you go to close the action in the future, and there'll be a sear here holding the firing pin back, you don't actually have to charge the entire mainspring. It's already sort of partially charged for you on opening. So anyway, you can sort of see how that works there. So basically closed, open, closed, open. So now the question is, how do we pull this apart if we wanted to replace parts or clean it? And this took me a little while to work out. There's no obvious screws or anything you have to push out. The first thing that comes to mind is this pin just here, which is what I originally believed to be the pivot point for this handle. So you can sort of see it rotates around that pin, but you'll actually find that that's made of polymer. It's plastic, and it's not intended to be the pivot point for this handle. You'll find that the force actually is distributed on the inside of this bolt here. I'll show you in a minute when I'll show you in a minute how that works. It's machined out so that the outside surface of the handle rides on that bolt, and this plastic, we'll call it a pin, this plastic pin here is basically just a guide for the spring. The mainspring travels through. So the way you pull this apart is you decock the bolt. You want a small flathead screwdriver like this, and the very first thing that needs to be removed is this hoop spring just here, and that is your ejector extractor string. So there's your extractor and there's your ejector there. So we should be careful. You don't want to bend this spring or compress it in any way, because it sort of has just the right amount of tension to grab the rim of the cartridge and do its job. So we just want to shimmy the flathead underneath the spring. Alright, now we're under it. So you want to just lift it up. See this little tab here rides in this rail. Just want to lift it up and over that, basically. There we go. So that's up on top. You can see just there. So now we can just push that up and over. Alright, easy enough to remove. There's your spring. Make sure these little tabs face forward when you reinstall. They sit in these grooves they sort of ride on top of the extractor claw itself. Let's put that spring aside. Now, at this point, you could remove the extractor claws if you wanted to. There's 2 roll pins, you can see them here, and you basically sort of punch them out from the top down. I'm not going to remove them here because the thing about roll pins is they're one use and I don't have any spares on me. So once you punch them out, you need to make sure you have the replacements to punch them back in. But with those removed, those 2 pins removed, then your extractor claws will just drop out basically, and those pins are what the claws pivot on. So next thing to remove is the firing pin itself, which just rides along the top of the bolt just here. So easiest thing to do now with this spring removed, which is what was holding it captive before, so you just push the firing pin up and you can just grab onto it with your fingers, and it's quite as simple as just shimming it out straight up out of the top of the bolt, right? So that click you heard was the main spring here jumping forward a bit, because if you remember from before, this part of the firing pin slightly compressed that spring basically. So when we pulled it out, the spring jumped forward. So we'll put that aside. All right, so next thing you want to do, orient it this way. So what's preventing this lug from coming out now is that it actually has a, you can't really see from here, but just under this edge just here, there's a sort of a lip to it. And if you try to remove the lug in this direction, it actually catches on the mainspring. So you can see the mainspring move slightly just there. So I'll try it again, I'll just tap it. So you watch the mainspring, the lug hits it there. So what you want to do, and no force is required at all. Basically, I'm just going to put this screwdriver through from the other side. And you can see, there's my screwdriver there. If I just compress the spring slightly, like the tiniest amount, then push the lug through. Now the lug can make it all the way through, and I can pull it out the other side. Just get a bit of a wobble. No force is required. I've got to emphasize this. You don't want to break anything. And the lug just pulls free. So you can see that this handle, this ball joint here, rides in here and controls the sideways movement of this lug, basically back and forth. But you can see the step I was referring to. Here we go. So let the camera focus. There's your step there, basically. So the mainspring was hitting the edge of that, basically. So you wanted to compress the mainspring just a little bit so that the lug can slide out. So with your lug removed, everything else just drops apart now, basically. So at this point, you want to get your mainspring here, which is made up of, I believe, 3 components. There's a sort of a guide rod down here. There's an upper, so that's a lower guide rod. There's an upper guide rod, and then there's a little ball at the back. So there's 3 little components wrapped around that spring, or to do with the spring. So you can just grab that spring and pull it through. So there's a little like ball bearing that sits right up in the end up here. So you just give it a bit of a tap, because the oil it's a bit sticky. The ball wants to stay out there. So you want the ball to drop down. Now with the mainspring pushed all the way fully forward, because that's the front of the bolt down here, this is the back of the bolt. So the mainspring pushed fully forward up against this face here, which it couldn't do before because that's where that lug would otherwise occupy. So the mainsprings move forward, a whole centimetre. So now the mainspring ends at about this point. It is now free of this pivot, and the ball bearing will be sitting inside that pivot. So pits are going to drop loose at this point, but basically this plastic pivot, which is what's holding in the handle, can now just push from bottom to top. So there's the top, it's larger, and there's the bottom, it's a bit smaller. It's got this channel inlet in it. So this is the top of the bolt. This is the bottom of the bolt, and you want to push the pin from bottom to top, making sure that your mainspring is pushed as far down as it'll go. So you can just push this pin out, out it comes. So you can set that aside. Your handle will come out, and then there's a little ball bearing that'll drop out as well. So there's your bolt handle. and then the ball bearing sits in the end. And you can sort of see, if I put the ball bearing aside, basically the ball bearing sits at the end of the mainspring. It sits in here. And if I pull the mainspring out, the whole mainspring assembly will just drop out the end now, so I can just push it out this way. So there's your mainspring assembly. So the front guide is this pin here, the larger of the two, and then the rear guide is this one here, and really this piece here really is just a seat because it sits on that ball bearing like that, and the mainspring sits between them. So what I'll do is I'll assemble that in order for you. So you have your bolt body there with the extractor claws, which I haven't removed just yet. You've got your spring guide to the front, or front spring guide. You've got your mainspring itself, which sits over the spring guide. You've got the rear spring guide. You've got this ball bearing here, which sits right at the back of the bolt. You have the bolt handle, which pivots here, and then you have this plastic piece, which is really not a pivot. It's, I'm going to call it that, but it's not really a pivot. It's not a full weight-bearing component. It basically just, at this hole here, acts as a guide for this spring, so the spring doesn't get caught up in the movement of the handle. It's just there as a guard, really, so that sits there like that. And then here's your locking lug with, it's got a little port there, which interfaces with this little cam, or this little ball here. Basically that rides, I can't really sit that straight just because of how it's balanced, but that rides back and forth this way. Here's your firing pin, which rides in here, basically, and the main spring will sit in this little cutout just there. So the main spring, well, really it's the head of this guide rod here, sits on that part of the firing pin, and that compresses and provides the shooting action. And then lastly is your extractor spring, and that is a disassembled bolt. Some words of advice: when I first got my Browning T-bolt, it was incredibly stiff. The very first thing I did was pull the bolt apart, and without any instructions I sort of had to guess what to do, and I put quite a bit of force into it. You can see my mainspring's a bit bent just there, so I've actually ordered a new mainspring to put in here. But now that I know that you don't need any force to pull this thing apart, well, I thought I'd pass that on to someone else, so then no one makes the same mistake I did. I'll have a different video showing how I smoothed up the trigger later on. About 80% of that trigger is plastic, so there's not much you can do there, and I'm quite frankly pretty disappointed in Browning that this is plastic at all. This should definitely all be made of metal. Like, I would pay the extra $1 if that was aluminium frame and a steel trigger and a steel body, but anyway, that's a different video. So with the bolts, first thing you want to do is, we were talking before about this cam surface here, which the firing pin actually rides up against. I'll see if I can recreate this. So this sort of sits like so, and the firing pin, as the bolt comes out, it pre-charges the firing pin. So it gives it a bit of charge on opening, and then when you close the bolt will go forward and lock, but the firing pin remains to the rear because it's held back by the sear. So it doesn't do the entire charge, it just does a partial charge. So a little bit of charge, I think I would estimate about 1/4 of the force on opening and 3/4 on closing. So if you want the opening force of your bolt to be a bit smoother, you can polish this cam, this runway just here. You don't want to remove any material. I've got to emphasize, you never want to remove material from guns. You only want to polish any kind of contact surfaces. So you want this surface here to be basically like a mirror finish, and that's what I've gone and done. I used some Mother's Mag polish and just by hand, polish that with a bit of cotton, cut out of a cotton shirt. So you just give that a polish there, nice and smooth. You don't want to touch the outside circumference of these lugs, so the left or the right one, it doesn't matter. They're both equally as important in locking the gun up. You don't want to nick that, polish it, file it, anything at all, because that there determines the lockup of your gun, and you want that to be as tight as possible. And the same can be said with the reciprocals on the receiver. You do not want to damage these at all on either side, because that's, the lockup of the gun. You never want to stuff with that. So the other thing you can do is given that knowledge that you know that the firing pin, I have it upside down here, but you know that the firing pin is going to ride up this surface. So you can polish this part just here of the firing pin, and you see mine's a bit shinier than normal. Just get rid of any machining burrs. I had quite a few burrs just there. Polish that, and then basically now the opening of the action will be a lot smoother. Now the bolt body itself is very well machined. It's a very complicated part. Looks like probably the most expensive part in the entire firearm to manufacture. There's a bit of burring when I bought it. You can still sort of see it inside this bore just here, which is where the lug rides up and down, or rides left and right in. Basically, I put a wooden dowel in there with a cotton shirt around it and just polished the inside of that. And once again, I didn't file it and I didn't remove any material. I just polished it up, make it nice and shiny, so that this lug can move freely and easily left and right through here. Lastly, I did a little bit of polishing around here, but not too much really. It was just to make sure there was no machining marks and no burrs here. That will polish on its own given time. I polished this little ball here because that's what interfaces with the lug, and you just want that to just not have any friction at all, basically rotating up and down. In here is quite rough, but I couldn't get into there, so I polished this side instead. Alright, reassembly. So what we'll do, it's a bit finicky just because you've got lots of little parts here, so I'll start by reassembling the mainspring. So I'll just put it back together. And it's 3 parts here. So you have the mainspring, and then you have the front guide, and then the rear guide just there, and the rear guide rests on that ball bearing. So with the mainspring assembled, you can put it back into the bolt. I'll turn it upside down just for easier visibility, but basically there's nothing stopping you from just pushing it through the bore in the back. So in she goes. You want to push that all the way forward, as far forward as she'll go. There you go. You notice with the spring fully forward, it clears this hole here, so the pin can be dropped in. Alright, with the mainspring installed, we'll get the bolt handle ready. And remember, the bolt handle is on the right side of the bolt, so if I rotate it around, this is top down now, so this is the top of the bolt, and this is the front, this is the rear. The bolt handle will be here, basically. So you insert that, just like so. So I find this is easier to do facing up or with the bolt upside down, like so. As you can see how the handle is just free to move. And you'll also note, by the way, that the outside surface of this circumference here on the bolt handle, that actually matches up perfectly with the milling on the inside of this bolt. And that is actually the weight bearing surface for the bolt handle. So when you're rapidly shooting this rifle, you're not putting any force on this plastic. The plastic is just to keep it for the bolt. So unless you're pulling the handle, if you pulled the handle straight out sideways, then you'd be putting force on this polymer. But if you're just using the rifle in normal operation, it's more than capable of dealing with the high force involved, as it just rotates around the inside of this racetrack here. And you also notice on the back of the bolt, you have this wing here. That wing there stops the ball bearing and the mainspring assembly from basically falling out the back. So we'll put the handle in. Remember, this is upside down, so the plastic pivot needs to come in from the top to the bottom in this direction. So what I'll do, I find the easiest way to do this is to put this ball bearing in. It's quite finicky. Put it inside the plastic, and you just got to keep it in there, basically. And you come in from the bottom, and this will be tricky to show on camera, but basically you come in from the bottom, just wiggle it until it's lined up, and then in it goes like that, with the ball bearing. You push it through, just make sure this is mostly lined up. You're going to make sure that this racetrack here lines up with the rest of it, so I've actually not done that correctly, so I'll push that back out, rotate it, align it, push it back up in. And now the bolt handle can pivot freely, it won't fall out, and you'll also find that the ball bearing won't fall out the end because now this wing prevents it from falling out, basically. So now, to keep this aligned, basically you can push the mainspring up and into the plastic piece, like that. Just wait for the camera to focus. So push this mainspring up and into the plastic piece, and now you'll find that this plastic pin won't come out anymore because the mainspring actually passes through it. Alright. Now the locking lug needs to go back in, and now that this is sort of all pieced together, it's not going to fall apart on us. You can actually rotate in whatever direction you want, it won't fall apart, that's fine, as long as the mainspring stays in there. So we'll hold it this way, so this is the top of the bolt and this is the front of the bolt. So here's your locking lug here, and it needs to go in this direction, basically, with this camming surface to the rear and the large lug on the right. So you can line up the port on the large lug with the little ball on the handle and just start seating that in. Just give it a little wiggle on the way in. Now, we've got the same problem as when we were pulling it apart. So you can see the mainsprings actually drop forward a bit, so I'll just push that out of the way. There we go. So you line that up, and there we go. There we go. So I've just married up this little port here with this ball, and now this can push through. No problems at all. See? And now it's held captive by that mainspring. So it's not going to come out now. Alright, so now the next part is to put the firing pin back in, and it sits in this order. So if this is the top of the bolt here, and that's the front, the firing pin will go in with this mechanism here, and this is what interacts with the sear. This will go down like so. Right, and the best way to put that in is if I just put it flat on the bench, and you can see the bird's eye view, you see that cam that's on the locking lug, and then you have the mainspring here, so the firing pin, this protrusion just here, this whole piece needs to sit in there. So coming in from the top, we can just start, what we'll do is we'll just pre-compress the firing pin spring, or the mainspring. So coming from the bottom with the screwdriver, just a little bit of compression there, like so, not much, a couple of mils of compression, put the firing pin in, line it up. There you go, just drop some little bit of wiggling to get it in there. There's a lot of little jagged edges on that. And now my screwdriver is between the mainspring and the firing pin spring, so you can just pull that out and the spring will just drop into place basically. So just like that. Now you saw that the firing pin spring wanted to rise back out, but it's held captive by that spring. So the last step here is to put the ejector spring back on, and that'll hold the firing pin in place, it won't come out. So what we do, here's your spring, you line up this little lug with the racetrack here, riding on top of the extractor claw, so you just put that in there. Like so, and then you just squeeze down and line up the other one. So this other one needs to come on down. There you go, pop it into place, and that'll snap in. So that lug rides on top of the extractor claw on both sides. And there you have it. So just check for functionality. Feels normal. Once again, opening the action or opening the bolt handle pre-charges the mainspring by a small amount. So it rides up that raceway. There you go. And then when you close the bolt, my screwdriver will act as the sear. It'll sit there basically. And when you close the bolt, it pushes the mainspring fully to the rear. So that's about, I'd say, a quarter charged or half charged. And then the sear charges the rest of the way when you close the bolt, kind of like a Lee Enfield. So with the action open, you can put the bolt back into the rifle. I'll just move the camera up here. So you can line that up. And once again, the safety needs to be on, and the this little silver toggle just here. You can see that. This little silver toggle here needs to be pushed down. So you notice that if you push that down, the sear rises up, and if you push the sear down, the toggle rises up. So they're the same part, they're connected, so we'll just push that toggle down. And the bolt can just slide right in. When the bolt enters, it pushes the sear down. You hear it click there, so now the bolt is captive, it won't come out. Alright, take the safety off and just check your bolt for functionality. So you just make sure everything's behaving as normal, and it is. So hope you guys found that useful. I'll see you next time.